hopefully this works better. I was making fun of Joel for that earlier too. Anyways, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2 and verses 1 through 12 for today, continuing on with what we've been talking about. And specifically here, I've titled this, The Magi Know Better. And hopefully, as we get through this, you will see the reason for this and why I think there's a very good point to be made in this. And again, we're in Matthew chapters 1 through 2, and the title for this sermon series is that the King is coming. And as we see here, the King in some sense has already come to this earth and made his presence known, but yet at the same time he hasn't fully revealed himself. And we'll see that basically in the next part where he begins to reveal himself and fully shows who he is. Right now, it's more of this point of he's come to earth, but very few people seem to know about his existence even. And again, we'll see that more clearly as we go throughout the rest of this sermon. But part of what we're going to see here is very similar to what we see throughout the entirety of the Bible. That God has revealed who he is and what he has done to people, and then they have a choice to make based upon that to determine how they're going to respond to it. And again, we see many different responses throughout all of it. Specifically with the people of God in Israel, they, for the most part, rejected him and chose not to accept how he revealed himself to them. Obviously, there were those who did it, like many of the prophets who oftentimes faced persecution because of it. And there were others in the midst of them who also did very similar things. But oftentimes in the Old Testament, we see it was actually people outside of the people of God who were the ones actually turning to him. If you remember a few weeks back in the sermon that Joel gave, he talked about some were even in Jesus' own genealogy, specifically Rahab and Ruth and others like that, who chose to accept the God of Israel rather than their own gods because they saw there was something different about him and that he was the only one true one. And again, we see so many times where people have to respond to the things that they've seen and heard about God and choose, again, whether or not they want to accept him or reject him. And that's one of the things we're going to find in the story itself, that there are multiple different people who respond in various ways to the birth of Jesus and what that might mean. And so just consider that as we're going through this, that we all have that same choice we have to make in this process of what we're going to do with God and how he's revealed himself. So let's get into this. It begins saying, "And of Jesus having been born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived into Jerusalem, saying, Where is the one having been brought forth King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and came to worship him." So I sort of already mentioned it, but it begins with the very fact that Jesus was born, that we get this whole story, that both chronologically and even in some sense because of what happened with Jesus being born, that we get the rest of the story that's going to come about from this, that it becomes the main purpose for it, that Jesus was born and then people are going to respond in their own ways to this birth. And the first basic group of people we get is Magi from the east. And there's a lot that have been said and thought about these people. Oftentimes they're called wise men. Sometimes even in songs they're called kings, which there's not really any evidence of. I think it was a tradition at some point, but there's no clear, at least biblical evidence of it. For the most part, what we know of this word meaning is that it was typically related to people who were somewhat considered wise men, sort of like what Daniel was when he was in the courts in both Babylon and Persia. I think it's more of a Persian word, so more references basically Persians who were doing that same sort of thing that Daniel did, giving counsels to kings, and oftentimes even for them they would read things from the stars, specifically signs, which may even relate to later on when they talk about seeing the star, that they were responding in some sense to that. But I think it also likely that because, again, it's related to Persia and that whole area where Israel went into exile, that they may have even had access to Daniel's writings or some other traditions or writings that the Jewish people would have brought with them when they went into exile there in the first place. So there may have been something that was known to them about this king that was coming to be born. There's even some thoughts that many people, not just the Jewish people, but others were expecting some king or some ruler to be born in Judea about this time. So that may very well be the reason of why they were seeking and coming, or even had any clue of this in the first place, because as we'll see, most of the people in that area didn't seem to have a clue that some special person had been born amongst them. And anyways, as they came, it says they were asking this question of, where is the one having been brought forth king of the Jews? That they were specifically looking for one who was king of the Jewish people, and they came all the way from the east, again, probably Persia type area. Anyways, it's where modern day Iraq and Iran, I think somewhere near that border, near the Persian Sea is. So they would have come from somewhere in that general direction all the way over to Jerusalem, and they get there and begin asking this question. But one of the things that's also been said about Magi is that they often went to basically give honor to kings and different royalty at periods of time. I think sometimes even related to the birth. But this is one of those cases, I feel like, where they actually had to ask the question of where, or no one was really giving them an answer to where it was. Usually when a king's born, everyone knows about it, that it's just common knowledge to the people. But yet in this case, again, it doesn't appear that most anyone had a clue that Jesus was being born. At most they knew is that they would have considered an illegitimate child was born to this woman who came down in this period of time, and they probably were mocking them at best if they even cared about it in the first place, that there was this sort of nonchalant response by the people there to the fact that he'd been born, which is probably different from what I feel like they experienced if they were going to seek out a king in a different area. Then it says that they saw his star, that this became the reason for them coming, because they saw this star that somehow even seemed to be really special. It's thought by some that it could have just been a star that came into existence at this point. Yeah, I don't know if that's the case or not, but God somehow used this in some place to get these people to come here. They also oftentimes connected a star being with people being born, or even more specifically with kings and royalty being born. They thought that the star came into existence because of that, because there were some connections they had like that. So that's likely, again, becomes the reason for why they would head in this direction in the first place, that they had all these, even many pagan ideas, but even just ideas in general that something was going to happen, and seeing this star caused them to head in this direction, and somehow, I guess they could see it was nearest Jerusalem or something, so they went there and began asking around for it. But even more specifically, at the very end here, it says that they came to worship him. And while this word can sometimes have meanings of just paying honor or respect to a person, I think we'll see throughout this that there's something more to it. At the very least, once they got to him, something changed if they didn't already have some clue of things beforehand. That there was something different about this child. Again, we've already beginning to see that he was born, and we know that he was born in circumstances that are not normal for someone who is supposed to be well known or a great king or anything of that nature. So there becomes something different about him. That whatever they might have known about him at this point when they came, I believe that something had to have changed, at least in the process, for them to know at least more. Whether or not they fully understood everything, we'll never know, but they seemed to understand something more once they got there. Continues on saying, but King Herod, having heard, was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And having led together all the high priests and scribes of the people, he was inquiring from them where the anointed one is being born. So it doesn't actually ever say that the Magi actually went and sought out King Herod, which is how I've always thought of it from the way people portray the stories and whatnot. But basically word gets back to him that they were asking around in Jerusalem this question of where this king was. And if you know anything about King Herod, well, it would have paranoid him, or made him even more paranoid than he already was. In the process, thinking that someone could actually be king of the Jews, because he sort of was already in that place, because Rome had given him the ability to rule over that whole area, even though he really wasn't Jewish himself. I think he might have had some kids who sort of were from a wife he had, but he himself was more of an Edomite, which is basically from the brother of Jacob. So they're both from Abraham, but they weren't actually part of the Jewish ancestry, if that makes sense. And anyways, he would have considered himself king of the Jews, and he probably would have wanted to be king over the entire world if he had the possibility of doing it. So he didn't like this thought of hearing that there was another king in this area who would have the ability to basically take his throne away from him. And it would have been the same way for many of the Jewish leaders that, as we'll see throughout the rest of the gospel, that they didn't want to accept Jesus because it meant they would lose their position and authority and all these other things. So it would have troubled them as well. And it may have been that many other people weren't really ready for change within the Jerusalem area as well and didn't want him there. But the point, I think, still is that they were didn't really care about the fact that these wise men had come asking where this king was. They didn't care that there was supposedly one who was supposed to be king over them. And again, I think we'll see some of that even more clearly through the rest of this in certain things that is pointing out that they basically don't do that they should have been doing in this process. But he went to the high priests and scribes who would have known the Old Testament very well to ask him where their anointed one is being born, which again, makes you wonder what in the world they were thinking of why Herod was asking them this, because it doesn't seem like they cared, and they gave him the answer, but they didn't seem to care to do anything about it, or recognizing that this one might have actually already been born. They just basically ignore this, or at least Matthew doesn't tell us anything about what they did. They just give him the answer. And they say to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for as it has been written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, by no means are you least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you will go out one ruling, who will shepherd my people Israel. So they went to Micah 5:2, as we know it, and had the response to it, that they simply told him that it was in Bethlehem where this one would be born. And even though we have all of it being quoted by them, it is possible that they just basically told them in Bethlehem, and then Matthew's adding his own version to the rest of it. But it does make you know that if they had told Herod all of this, it would have made him even more paranoid than he already was, because it would have more clearly shown that this one was meant to be the ruler of all the people of Judah. But I think one of the reasons for why people, it might have even been at this point trying to do away with this kind of scripture like people do today, because they wouldn't have seen anyone being born in Bethlehem as of much of any importance. It was just a small little town near Jerusalem that had, it did have significance pointing back to King David, but I don't know if they cared much about that by this period of time. That again, it speaks of it, it says that it's not least among the leaders of Judah, but they would have seen it that way. But yet this person saying that it's not least because for out of them will go run one ruling who will shepherd his people. That God is pointing out to them that their one to come is going to be born in Bethlehem, and though it seems like of no significance, this is the very one who will be shepherding and leading their people. Specifically, that shepherd my people Israel part connects well with something it says earlier in the Old Testament, and I don't know whether Micah knew about it or if he was clearly referencing it, but it clearly connects. And it's all the way back in 2 Samuel 5:2-3, where it says, in times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So again, God had told them, and the people had known that David was the one who was going to be shepherding them. And since obviously the promise was made to David of a king coming after him, and specifically the fact that, Jesus, through the genealogies, is the very one who fulfills that, it makes sense that the same thing said about David would be said about Jesus in ruling over the people. But yet, the one difference we see here is that at this point, the people went and they actually made a covenant with David to be king over them. While here, Jesus shows up and everyone just ignores the fact that it's even happening in the first place. That if they were actually paying attention and following what the scripture said, you would think they would go to him and be welcoming him as their king. But again, we see that's not what's happening. There's this nonchalant response by all the people, the Jewish people in that area. They didn't have to travel like the Magi did. They were just there, and they didn't seem to care about the fact that this supposed one had been born to them. they didn't care enough to even check it out to see if there was any accuracy to it, I guess you could say. It says, then Herod, without public notice, having summoned the Magi, strictly inquired from them the time of the star being visible. And having sent them into Bethlehem, he said, having gone out, carefully search out concerning the child. And as soon as you might find him, report to me, so that I myself also, having gone, might worship him. If you know what's coming next, which Joel will be preaching about next week, you know the exact reason for why he's doing this. But basically, he's playing games with the Magi. He doesn't mean anything he's actually saying. And then you can sort of see that from the fact that it says that he does this without public notice. That from right away, you can see he's trying to do something and not let anyone else know about what he's doing. And again, he inquires from them the time of the star for, again, something that he's going to do next week for basically the timing of things. But the one thing it does mention here is that he does point them towards Bethlehem at this point. So he sends them on their way there. Again, they came with some knowledge of this king being born, but they didn't have all the details of everything. And so they're getting it, but we're going to see that they're still being led in that process. But what Herod is doing is basically he's trying to get these Magi to do his dirty work of figuring out where this one is so that he can then go and do what he's going to do. And honestly, he has zero desire to worship anyone. In fact, he'd rather have this one be worshiping him instead. So again, we sort of begin to see part of the character of him that becomes even more clearer in what Joel will talk about next week, for those of you who don't already know the story. It says, and the ones having heard the king went out, and behold, the star which they saw in the east was leading before them, having gone until it stood over where the child was. And having seen the star, they rejoiced in extremely great joy. So, again, from this point, they got Bethlehem, so they went out from there and began going to Bethlehem. And it speaks of the star continuing to lead them in this process. Exactly what that looks like, I really don't know. It seems weird how you could actually be led by a star, but maybe it seemed like it was moving to them as they were walking until it finally just stopped moving, so they finally realized that was about the place they were at. Or maybe it was actually somehow shining a light literally down on them, leading them. I don't really know, but it's just sort of interesting to think about how exactly they would be able to be led by the star. But the bigger point here is the very last point, that having seen the star, they rejoiced in extremely great joy. That they were so happy once they finally got to this place and found this king. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it could be the very fact that it was a lot harder to find this one than it was for them when they typically would have gone out seeking kings. Because again, everyone knows where the king is, but this one they had to search harder for. So that may be part of it. And it may also be part of that they finally just found exactly what they were looking for and why they came in the first place. And they know that there's something, again, different about this one than about the rest of them. But again, this continually shows the contrast between what the rest of the people were doing and what these Magi were doing and truly seeking Jesus out. And it finishes off saying, and having come into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. And having fallen, worshipped him. And having opened their treasures, they brought to him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been given divine revelation, according to a dream, to not return to Herod, through another way they withdrew into their region. So once they get there, they find them living in this house. And it's interesting to know that it doesn't ever actually specify that it was their own house they were staying in. It is possible, because I don't know who would have really wanted to allow them in there, because they were sort of outcast because, again, it was an illegitimate birth. But it's still the point that this may have been another point of showing that Jesus was born and began in very humble circumstances, completely opposed to what you would expect from a coming king. That, again, Matthew in this gospel is setting this up very clearly, that Jesus came in a very different way for a very different purpose than what people were going to be expecting. But whatever happened when these wise men actually got there, it says, having fallen, they worshipped him. And I think this is another one of driving home those points that they probably did actually worship him, because it's almost like a double meaning, because worship itself means to get down and bow down to a person. So it's almost as if he's basically emphasizing the point that they did actually worship him at this point, that whether or not something changed and they fully saw who he was during the circumstance, or whether or not they already had somewhat of a clue having come, that something changed within them and they were worshiping this one as being something different from the rest of them. And having opened their treasures, they brought to him gifts. Again, this is common when really anyone was going to see a king, that they would bring gifts to him, and typically gifts that were fit for a king themselves. And again, all those three ones that I mentioned were all very expensive and were not things you could just easily get. You had to oftentimes even go trading for them, or which they may have done on their way there. They may have gotten them through some kind of trading before they came. It even says their treasures. It may have been things that they had from the past that they wanted to come and give to this one. Might be reading something into it, but it's still the point that these things were very expensive that they came and brought to him, and they sacrificed a lot of what they had, even though they may have been extremely wealthy, but they still sacrificed part of what they had to give to this one. But the three things themselves may have more significance than we realize, that it's not just the fact that they were very expensive gifts to show he's the king, but gold itself really re-emphasizes the kingly thing, because that's probably something you would bring to any king at any point, because it's what most people consider the most valuable thing. But when you get to frankincense, at least through the Old Testament usages, it was typically connected with the priesthood and the stuff that was done within the temple. If they had incense burning, and basically it may very well foreshadow the fact that Jesus becomes the real and only true high priest who matters to us, because he's the only one who can take away our sin. And then myrrh itself, though it had different uses, it was often mostly connected to embalming, or again, burying a body, and the Gospel of John clearly states that. So it may very well be that this gift is foreshadowing Jesus' death that's going to be coming. And whether or not the wise men knew this, these Magi, or whether or not Matthew's just sort of adding his thing or reasoning into it, it still seems that there's somewhat of a foreshadowing process to what's going to happen within Jesus that we get right in this very spot. But the very last point is really interesting too. It says that these Magi received a divine revelation, that this God that they really didn't know probably, they might have known a little bit about him, but they certainly probably didn't have any kind of relationship of any sort with him, comes to them in a dream and tells them not to go back to Herod. And what they do is, it says through another way, they withdrew to their region. Basically, this is to say that they obeyed that divine revelation that was given to them, something that even people today have trouble with doing, that it's not always easy to obey the things that God says when they're hard to do. That, I mean, in some sense, what they're doing here is completely disobeying the order of the king of this area that they've come to, so there could be punishments for them if they got caught. I don't know if in this divine revelation they were told they would be protected or not, but they still trusted and obeyed this God they really didn't know and went in this direction. So all of this is to say why I think it's best titled that the Magi know better. That they went and sought out this king from distant lands that no one else in the whole area seemed to care or want to do anything about. Again, there's this response that they didn't care that there was this supposed king born to them. You would think if there was a king of their own people who was being born, they would be excited or want something to do with it, and yet nothing happens. And we get nothing. Even in the Gospel of Luke, where it also records Jesus' birth, it really doesn't say anything about any of the Jewish people coming and doing anything with him. All you get is the fact that when he goes to the temple, he does meet Anna the prophetess and Simeon, that there were a few within Israel who seemed to care about this, but yet the vast majority of the people just had this attitude of rejecting exactly what was going on. That, again, I think this story shows that part of that accepting or rejecting who God is comes with whether or not we're going to seek him out. And when we refuse to seek him out, despite knowing who he is and what we should be doing, that's the same thing as ultimately rejecting him, as the people in Jerusalem were doing. On the other side, these Magi came from, again, far away, and it probably took them at least a year or so to get there. And then at least that's the time it was after Jesus was born, they probably got there. And they were seeking him out with everything that they had. Again, maybe even offering, because they were given these very expensive gifts, they might have been offering to some degree everything that they had in the process. And that showed their acceptance of him, even if they didn't fully know or understand everything in the process. And so that same thing applies to us today, that it comes to the question of whether or not we're going to seek him out, whether or not we're going to be like the Jewish people and stay within our own comforts with our money or our just the way our life goes, and not wanting to have anything changed in that process, and again, be rejecting God in that same process, or whether or not we're going to choose to leave behind those very things that are easy for us to do and actually go long distances or whatever that looks like, and actually seek him out with everything that we have. That becomes the question that we have to answer for ourselves of what we're going to do in this process. Are we going to be like the Magi? Are we going to be like the rest of the people in this story? And again, I think it all comes down to the point of actually truly seeking him out. And I think that leads into communion well, because what we see is the fact that Jesus came and took upon a body. That, again, he is the King who is coming, but yet at the same time, he has arrived there. But yet no one seems to know or care about that decision besides these small group of people who came from distant lands to find him. But he took upon a body for us and gave everything that he had for our own sakes. And so we owe him ultimately nothing less than that in return. And that becomes what we need to consider as we go through this time. That really we should only be taking this if our lives are actually showing that within it, that we're seeking him out with everything that we have, that our lives are showing it, then we should be taking communion for the sake of being encouraged and motivated to continue doing that within our lives. Where if we don't believe that and are rejecting it, then we don't have a purpose for taking communion, and it's just a thing that we do in vain. And we have to remember that these elements are representing what Jesus did for us, and unless we're truly living out the way that he's called us to respond to it, then we have no purpose for this, and we need to basically get ourselves to the point of resubmitting ourselves to him and trying to seek him out with everything. So just take the time to consider that as the servers come forward and pass these elements out to you, where you're at in that, and what you want to or need to do to change that if that's what you're truly wanting to do here. If you really want to seek him in everything that you have. So just take this time to consider that while they pass these out, and then we'll take them together once they're done. So again, we remember that Jesus, at this point and where we are in Matthew, came and took upon this body for us, so that as Philippians says, he didn't just take upon the body to be able to save us, but he also became a servant of all, so that he could serve us in all things and ultimately give his life for our sake. So again, remember, he broke his body for us, and we owe nothing more than to be willing to give up whatever it takes for his sake, no matter how hard or how much that might cost, because we truly want to seek him in all things. So he says to do this in remembrance of him. In the same way with the cup, he said that it was the blood of the covenant, that again, that without the shedding of blood, there was no covering for the sins. And interestingly, as Chuck Ness was actually telling me earlier this week, that there was great bloodshed throughout many of the sacrifices throughout all of Israel's history. Even though they didn't always do a great job of it, there was still the times they were doing the Passover lambs, and even when, like Solomon dedicated the temple. And yet all of that blood, the great amount of it, doesn't even compare to even one little drop of the blood that Jesus gave in shedding his own. In giving his own life, he was able to redeem the whole world, and that nothing else could ever do in any sense to reconcile us back to him. So we remember him in doing this to give him our entire lives to live out for him. So let's pray. Lord, we just thank you so much for what you have done for us, and how you've led us to you through what you've done in reconciling us back both to you and to one another. And we just pray that you continue in this to lead and guide us in all things, and just pray that you go with us as we go out from here to continue to do those things in all of our lives. And we just pray that, again, you help us where we're falling short and struggling, and just for us to continue to seek you in all things. And we just pray all this in your name.